Tensions between China and the United States are still running high, even with a new president in the White House. We will take a look at relations between the world's two largest economies. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Relations between the United States and China took a turn for the worse when former President Donald Trump was in office. He imposed trade tariffs on Chinese goods and sanctions on Chinese companies and blamed China for the coronavirus. Foreign policy analysts expected an easing of tensions under President Joe Biden, but that's not what happened. Biden talks about competing with China, and the country is viewed as a rival. According to a recent poll by the Pew Research Center, 89% of Americans consider China a competitor or an enemy, and only 9% view it as a partner. Well, to talk more now about relations between these two countries, let's turn to CGTN's White House correspondent Nathan King, who is on Capitol Hill. Nathan, you follow this relationship very closely between the world's two biggest economies. What can you tell us about where it is right now?
By the way, Anand, good to see you again, but I wasn't one of those analysts who said it would be better under President Biden. What I did say is that the rhetoric would calm down, but the policy is probably the same and actually probably a little bit more coordinated. And that's kind of where we are right now. You read out that poll. There is a real bipartisan feeling in Washington, inside the so-called Beltway, that China is the biggest threat in terms of economics, perhaps not strategically or militarily, and that basically spans both parties. And China didn't get a vote. And essentially, what's the new administration doing is, rather than scattershot and sort of zero-sum language, they have a policy which is essentially called cooperation with China when they can, like over climate change, compete with China on the industries of tomorrow. We're talking about, of course, electric vehicles, climate, or everything for climate change, and AI going forward, even pharmaceuticals, and also confront. And we've seen a lot of confronting, actually, especially when it comes to human rights, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan. We saw a raft of announcements, so it's a little bit more coordinated. And if you basically spend any time listening to what they say here in this building behind me, the legislation coming through, for example, the Strategic Competition Act of 2021 is a Cold War document if ever read one. I mean, I think it's a huge mistake, personally. There are others that disagree with me and others that agree. There's the Endless Frontier Act as well, trying to regain dominance in science, which basically also looks to monitor Chinese students and make sure that American scientists don't go abroad. So it's basically this idea of strength at home will be able to compete with China abroad. This is exactly what President Joe Biden said in his address to the joint session of Congress to mark his 100 days in office. Let's take a listen.
America will stand up to unfair trade practices that undercut American workers and American industries, like subsidies from state to state-owned operations and enterprises, and the theft of American technology and intellectual property. I also told President Xi that we'll maintain a strong military presence in the Indo-Pacific, just as we do with NATO and Europe, not to start a conflict, but to prevent one.
And on that last point, it's been very interesting. The Pentagon, with the new administration, have really sort of been banging the Cold War drums, not necessarily the war drums, asking for more ships, more money. There has been a big emphasis on Taiwan, which threatens 40 years of the one China principle. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this develops. Is this a domestic device to pull Americans together to focus on competition, or is this really a strategic idea of keeping US top dog when it comes to the economy and militarily too? To be answered.
Nathan, well on the point, former President Donald Trump, he believed in America first. He said that all the time. Biden has taken a little bit of a different strategy and he's trying to get support from European allies. He's been working with European allies, but is that strategy working?
Well, he has been working with allies. Remember the first trip by Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and of course Secretary of State just mentioned, was to actually Asia. They went to Japan and they went to Seoul. They also ended up in Alaska, and you remember I was there, and there was some very frosty exchanges to suit the temperature. But what was very interesting is that even though we saw Prime Minister Xu come here, we're going to see, by the way, Moon Jae-in, the head of the president from the Republic of Korea, here on Friday, is that there is a little bit of a pushback from allies, especially Seoul. They are not seeing, for example, the animosity against China recently, despite some spats. They realize China is very important for their Sunshine Policy 2.0 when it comes to the DPRK. And they also are resisting to be further tied to that Quad, the so-called alliance of democracies with India, Japan, and Australia and the US. And Japan, too, really wants the US to come back in to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which of course Trump pulled out of. But there is no sign here the Biden administration will do it. And remember, the Biden administration also still have all those tariffs on over $300 billion worth of Chinese imports. They're in no hurry to lift them. There are going to be negotiations soon. So essentially, also when it comes to Europe, pressure over human rights, well, there is some movement, especially with the UK, which has always been closer to Washington than it has been to Brussels, let's face it. But there is resistance from France, and especially Germany too, who is being bullied on another front when it comes to gas pipelines from Russia. So don't expect immediate buy-in. And let's face it, allies have been burnt in the last few years when it comes to committing to policies under Trump. And there's a big debate in Australia right now about that too. So don't just count allies. And I forgot to mention ASEAN, by the way, who really don't want to choose between the US and China. And they feel, a lot of them, that they may be forced to do so because of Washington.
Thanks, Nathan. That's CGTN White House correspondent Nathan King reporting there. Well, there is a lot to discuss. Let's bring in our panelists. From Beijing, Qinduo Xu is a senior fellow with the Pangoal Institution and host of CGTN's Dialogue Weekend. Also from Beijing via Skype, Wang is the founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization. Daniel Russel is the Vice President for the Asia Society Policy Institute and former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs. He joins us from Tokyo via Skype. And also via Skype from Miami, Remi Piet is a senior partner at Embellie Advisory. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for being with us. Wang, let me start with you. If we look at the Biden policy over the last few months, insofar as it concerns China, the president has followed very much the playbook of Donald Trump on China policy. The trade war continues. We've heard very tough rhetoric from the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, accusing China of acting more aggressively abroad. How bad are relations right now?
Well, thank you. I think the relationship is actually still at a very low point, as a matter of fact. However, I do agree with your White House correspondent that the President Biden took a little different approach. Certainly, he didn't, use attack CPC anymore, and like Trump did. He didn't call China virus and things like that. But I think he's still facing, like the poll you studied on the Pew, that there's a bipartisan consensus on the General Congress across the board, probably in the U.S. That was actually due to the 4 years of Trump, or even longer. A lot of the accumulations that built to that. But I think there's things can be done to really slowing down. I have been talking with some U.S. opinion leaders like Graham Allison, Joseph Nye, or even Tom Friedman. I mean, they didn't agree there should be a Cold War, and so I think that is really probably we should really rule that out. We should not repeat what has happened last century. We should not use last century measures or actions to against 21st century reality. So I'm glad to see Secretary Blinken speak at the G7 Foreign Minister meeting that he doesn't want to have a Cold War with China. It's a bad energy, and also he said countries shouldn't pick sides between China and the U.S. So those are positive signs. What I think could be done is that because China and the U.S. are now the two largest trading nations, actually China trade import from the world since China joined WTO, this is 20-year anniversary, has increased 6 times. And the U.S. export to China has increased 5 times. even though China's exports to the world has increased 7 times. So it's all benefit. China is a blessing. I mean, it's a positive thing to the world. So I think maybe we should take some pragmatic approach, maybe increasing the people-to-people exchanges, student exchanges, and things like that. Tourism, investment, we should really come back to the reality, and we are really integrated together.
Daniel, something we heard from our correspondent as well as from Henry a moment ago was that the Biden administration has a different approach, but is it really a different approach? I mean, the rhetoric may have changed, but the policies have not, haven't they?
Well, Anand, thanks for having me. I think it's extremely important to recognize the differences, and I think the differences with Trump are profound. Remember, what was Trump's policy after all? He blamed China for America's problems, and Biden is taking the opposite tack. He's saying we've got to solve American problems so that we can compete more effectively on the global stage. We saw Trump ignore American foundational principles in his, quest for a trade deal. Biden's the opposite. He's not going to trade universal principles like human rights and the rule of law for a profit. I think we saw under Trump, the use of sensitive issues like Taiwan as a form of pressure, even punishment against Beijing. And now Beijing may not like Biden's policies on Taiwan and on South China Sea, but they reflect U.S. values and interests. It's not about poking sensitive spots on the Chinese side. I think it's also important not only to recognize that a lot has changed on the U.S. side. We've got a much more organized, coordinated national security policy team of veterans, but at the same time, U.S. fundamental interests haven't changed. Very little has, if anything, has changed on the Chinese side, either in terms of the party in charge, the people in charge, the behaviors, and the problem sets haven't changed. Either the areas of disagreement, over Taiwan, over treatment of China's neighbors or its minorities, and on the global scene, the challenges of the pandemic, of climate change, of cybercrime, global economy, and so on. So we should be clear about what is the same and what isn't the same.
Qinduo Xu, what is your view on this? I mean, the complaints that President Biden has leveled against China, they're not new. We've heard these complaints before. Things like unfair trade practices, complaints about intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers. But in some respects, the pressure's increased. We just heard from Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House of Representatives here at the U.S. Congress, saying that the United States should boycott the 2022 Winter Olympics. How does China see all of this?
Well, obviously, I think if you look at the 100 days for the Biden administration, I do agree. If there's a illusion on the Chinese side that somehow the relationship will be reset under the new administration, I think people should wake up. Obviously, it's not the case. It's largely a continuation in terms of the U.S. strategy toward China. The nature of U.S.-China policy remains the same as the Trump administration. That is, whatever you can call it, like a confrontation, containment, or new Cold War. It's close to that, let's say. It's not a repetition of the Cold War with the former Soviet Union. So it's up to the Chinese side to have a comprehensive review of its policy toward the U.S. For example, in what area, like China is going to compete with the U.S., or whether China is ready to compete with the U.S., and how to compete fairly in a transparent manner, in a fair manner. And also at the same time, I think China should take the initiative to talk to the U.S. side over the more dangerous area, I would say, such as Taiwan, the South China Sea. There are military affairs over there. Of course, the U.S. side would say we need to strengthen our posturing over Taiwan, South China Sea. It's the same for China. China can't afford to be weak over Taiwan militarily, let's say. Let's be frank. So then there's an issue, like the two sides need to manage risks. Or risk to manage the potential dangers of the two militaries over there. And also China needs to think about it, with the regional, U.S. is strengthening regional alliance and building new alliance like a Quad system. What should China respond to that? And also internationally, U.S. is drawing the line, basically, forming alliances or strengthening alliances by value. When we talk about value, it's I would say it's far-reaching the impact, because when you talk about the value, basically it's a zero sum, because you are different from us, you are different from me, so there's no possibility for us to work together. So basically, you stress very much the fundamental differences between the two systems, the two cultures, the two political systems, ideologies. And then it's very difficult to find area to cooperate. Even there is area like climate change, pandemic, global transnational crimes, cyber attacks. We're not basically seeing the cooperation between the two sides. Very limited cooperation on climate change. Mostly the relationship over the past, say, 100 days is about competition and confrontation.
Remi, Piet, this effort by the Biden administration to get some kind of common view on China, there was a member of the German parliament recently who said, a member of the CDU, who said that the rivalry between China and the United States is set to become the defining power struggle of the 21st century. I mean, there have been calls from both sides of the Atlantic to take a common position on China, but as we heard from our correspondent, it's not easy. There are very fragmented views in Europe. What do you make of the European view on this?
So it's actually quite interesting, and first of all, thank you for having me. And my fellow panelists have given a very interesting, map of the situation in terms of the geopolitical landscape here, and the fears of the rising hegemon, Chinese hegemon, that is still there. Whether or not you're looking at the, the Trump administration or the Biden administration, the foundations of the potential conflict between China and the U.S. have not changed. What has changed, indeed, is the take from the Biden administration to rely more on a series of different alliances. So whether you're looking at regional alliances at the regional level in Asia, or other large, economic powers such as the European Union, and work together in trying to frame a new narrative or a new long-term vision, not short-term objectives, which was the classic way of the Trump administration diplomacy, of the Twitter diplomacy, and trying to strike a deal very quickly, but rather, try to set up what are the bases for a potential agreement. In the case of the European Union, you're seeing also, with the arrival of the Biden administration, a back to normal situation in terms of foreign policies towards China. There has been a series of discussions and sometimes moments of collaboration, others of conflict between China and the European Union. But it's clearly that that it's at the level of Brussels that you need to work, and there's actually some level of cohesion. If you look at European Union countries, apart from Hungary, which has been very close to the Chinese interest, the rest of the countries in the European Union have shown a lot of solidarity towards their views in terms of relationship with China, looking at key values. That was an important term that was mentioned up to now, of reciprocity, the idea that investments towards China should actually follow the same rules, whether you're a foreign investor or a local investor, which is more the rules actually inside the European Union. So it's the idea of reciprocity, and that's the basis that the Biden administration, and in cohesion with the European Union, want to work on when it comes to economic aspects to this rivalry, this complex relationship between China and the U.S. or the European Union, playing maybe potentially the role of a broker, a facilitator down the road on issues of climate change. We're going to see France, leading the European Union early next year on issues of climate change specifically, which is an area of potential cohesion, on clarification of supply chains, and that's what also is being referred by the Biden administration in terms of trade distortion behaviors, and that's when you look at transparency in raw materials such as steel, aluminum, and other minerals. But those are issues that will be on the roadmap for negotiations in the near future.
All right, Daniel, Russel, President Biden, of course, has taken a tough approach, as we've been discussing, on China. But what is the ultimate goal of this kind of approach? Because, we heard from our other guests as well, when there is talk of values and a difference of values, countries are different, as our Beijing guest told us. They follow different systems as well. Is the Biden position be more like us? And that, of course, could be code language for regime change.
Oh, absolutely not. Look, the U.S. and China have had very different systems since 1949. And from 72 on, we have found ways and arenas in which we can and have cooperated to our mutual benefit and to the benefit of the world. So there shouldn't be any question about the possibility of practical cooperation. The fact, though, is that particularly with the immense growth of Chinese national power and wealth, and China's increasingly global reach, our interests intersect in areas that they never have before, and this is immensely complex. We have, as Henry and others have described, a very toxic atmosphere now in both capitals, where each side is convinced of the righteousness of its own cause and pretty suspicious about the other. But there are still many areas where our interests overlap and converge. There are a number of areas where, frankly, we're putting the world at risk if we don't coordinate and don't cooperate. But the point I'd make on is that it's not really sort of a matter of which issue should we be cooperating on, or the abstract question of can we cooperate. What matters is the people, the leaders, and that's why, notwithstanding Graham Allison, we're not destined for war. Neither leader wants either a Cold War or a hot war. Mm-hmm. There's human agency in the choices that governments make. And so our leaders, the senior officials, their attitude, their behavior, their willingness to compromise for the greater good, these are all important factors. Mm-hmm. I do not think, as I've said, that the Biden administration is simply an extension of the Trump approach. To the contrary, I happen to know from personal experience what a important relationship Joe Biden and Xi Jinping forged person to person, politician to politician, from 2011 on, when they were both vice presidents. So the last point I'd make on is that if the view in Beijing is that, well, America tied the knot and now it needs to untie it to make amends and we're just going to sit here and wait, it's going to be a long wait. Okay. There really needs to be some work on the Chinese side as well.
Qinduo Xu, on the risk of a possibility of a Cold War, and that Cold War possibly becoming a hot war, there was an interesting op-ed piece published in the New York Times not so long ago. It was written by a prominent U.S. commentator, Piet, who said that current U.S. policy towards China, especially Biden's comments on Taiwan, are, quote, increasing the odds of a catastrophic war. What do you make of that?
Well, that is referring to the U.S.-Taiwan policy, the evolvement of Taiwan policy, a previous discussion of whether Washington should be, give up this vague policy, strategic vagueness about Taiwan, or make a public promise to defend Taiwan in whatever situation. That would be the bottom line, and I obviously, if there's such a thing, basically there's no maneuver room for Beijing and Washington in time of crisis over Taiwan. Previously, both sides, I would say, they have managed very well about the Taiwan issue, basically, because stability and tranquility over the Taiwan streets is in the interest of China and also in the interest of the United States. Yeah. I don't think, I would say it will not be in Washington's interest to give up that kind of policy or to encourage, or any policy that will encourage Taiwan to declare independence, because that really means nothing the Chinese side can do. It will resort to whatever it has, whatever means it have to achieve the final reunification. So that would be horrible for both sides.
Henry Wang, we've heard Graham Allison being quoted several times here. You mentioned him first. He's the Harvard Chinese scholar, by the way. There was an interesting comparison made by Graham Allison. He compared China and the United States to inseparable conjoined twins in which if one gives way to its impulses, he said, and strangles the other, it will just succeed in killing them both. What did you make of that comparison?
Absolutely, absolutely. I totally agree with him. Actually, he said that to me while we were having dialogue. What I think now, I also agree partly with what Daniel has just said. The world is really changed now. We have to have the U.S. and China working together rather than working opposite. So really, it's so important. We have this pandemic issue still, is lingering on and widely spread again. And also we have, now we have the Palestinian, Israel, Middle East in crisis now also. We have other climate change issues that we have to face. It's a big transformation, a green revolution that is going on. We have infrastructure in the world. We have to really, build it up. So it's so many things that China and U.S. needs to work together, and then we don't see that happening. That is really a thing. So I'm really, pleased to see that if U.S. can really put its house in order, for example, infrastructure, and then also get, like a pandemic. I'm glad to see that the U.S. is also follow President Xi's commitment. President Biden pledged $2 billion in fighting pandemic. Yeah. Now it's even contributing the vaccine. So I hope that while we are do more on our both domestic issues, then maybe we'll come to the cool heads and then really think, yeah, gee, we have to work together. It's a complex world. We can't fight it with each other. So I think that is really the message that we need to bring out.
Okay, Remi, Piet, as Henry just told us, there's so many things that the two countries need to work on together. The United States and China have shown a willingness to work on, for instance, climate change. That's the most prominent of them. But it seems a little bit of a schizophrenic policy on the part of the United States to say, we will cooperate with you on climate change, but then on other things, we're going to continue to batter you. Is that a strategy that's going to work?
Well, when you actually come to international negotiations, often it comes to several issues that could be pilots of collaboration. And obviously the one on climate change makes the most sense because it actually is a threat for all of us and we need collaboration on this issue. This is also a way to see how on key elements of trade, of production, of transparency, as I mentioned, of supply chains, mineral exploitations, for example, how there's capacities to find some common ground on the values and on the ways of doing business with multilateral backing. Now, obviously, in terms of issues of security, others, which are more global in terms of competition on certain key markets, there's going to be still a lot of antagonism. Keep in mind, obviously, that the Biden administration is just starting. So we're looking at, especially in the eyes of Joe Biden, of 4 years of developing a strategy where he wants the European Union to be its ally. And that's where, there was a specific, push towards, moving away from the joint agreement on investment between China and the European Union, which was the Angela Merkel proposal, and that is going to be renegotiating, especially some of the annexes, but that could be a good blueprint to move forward. So there are avenues for collaboration. That may sound naive, but the world actually really needs it, and the incentive to do so, and the way to craft, collaboration that would actually make sense economically and socially without interference into domestic affairs sometimes, or at least, maintaining key, stance on some key issues of values and representation, right, would allow, for an example of collaboration between those great leaders, those great countries on key issues that we mentioned in energy, raw material, and climate change, most and foremost.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for a great discussion. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arend Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.